Hello and welcome to the session on how best to build back better. My name is Paweł Świeboda. I'm the Director General of the Human Brain Project and CEO of EBRAINS Research Infrastructure. And the panel that we are about to begin will aim to address the question of the century, namely how to implement plans for carbon neutrality while also ensuring fairness. And we are meeting just a few days after COP26 moved the needle on some of the essential commitments, including with respect to keeping the level of temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, including with respect to phasing down coal power and fossil fuel subsidies, or reducing methane emissions. The most important issue now is how to transition from these targets to concrete plans. And Europe itself is pretty well placed, having laid down its ambitious Green Deal agenda in the past couple of years. Second big challenge is to continue global coordination, including with respect to embedding the externality of carbon pollution into the prices that companies pay around the world. Today, 3/4 of global emissions are not priced at all. They are priced at zero, while the global average carbon price is $5 per ton. And the third essential question has to do with the real scope of the 30-year transition that we are currently embarking upon, namely, what is going to be the composition of growth? How will the costs of the transition be distributed? What about the regressive nature of carbon taxation and how to cushion the impact on consumers? So to address these questions, we have a group of distinguished policymakers, a banker, and two economists. So in the sequence in which I will invite them to contribute, we have with us Heidi Hautala, the Vice President of the European Parliament, warm welcome. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, the United Nations, warm welcome as well. Maria Demertzis, Deputy Director of the Bruegel think tank. Mikołaj Dowgielewicz, Director General and the representative of the European Investment Bank to the European institutions in Brussels. And last but not least, Jakob von Kirkegaard, who is Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute and also at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. So this is a stellar panel, and I would like to go first to Madam Heidi Hautala with the question about this impressive legislative package, which we now have on our agenda in Europe. And if you could comment on how you find the balance between the objectives of carbon neutrality and the objectives of fairness to be expressed in this package. Is that equilibrium, in your view, the right one, or do we need some further improvements and adjustments? Let me just say before I give you the floor that we will have the first introductory discussion among ourselves, and we will then open for questions. So I invite everyone to contribute their questions through the Q&A channel. So the first remarks should be relatively brief. We will then have a chance to explore things in more detail. So, Madam Hautala, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paweł. It's a fascinating opportunity to exchange views. And in the previous panel, the participants were speaking more about sort of foreign policy, classical foreign policy and EU's role there. But I think here we are speaking about something which is much less ideological. I would say that the benefit of where we are now with combating climate change and building back green and digital is that these ideas seem to be very much shared and something that our partners outside the EU are interested to learn from and share with us, and we have a possibility to support them. The last minute incidents in Glasgow, which you all have seen, were very interesting to me because India perhaps encouraged by China, but nevertheless, it was the voice of India and poorer countries who said that, look, we have now a situation where you, the rich countries, have spent almost all the carbon budget that is available to the 1.5 target. So now it's our turn. Now it's we who can spend what is left. And please look at your wasteful consumption in the rich countries. I definitely took a message from this because I feel that we need to take the climate injustice back to the picture, and we need to make sure that developing countries feel that also this historical responsibility that developed countries have is leading to a bigger, multiplication of support that we are giving to the poorer countries. So I think otherwise we're not going to have any kind of further progress on really coming to the 1.5 degree goal. So that's for me key. And I see that the European Union has a lot of soft power. Maybe it's weak in hard power, but it has a lot of soft power through its internal market. And I'm coming to say that we do not only have the Fit for 55 package, which is largely internal EU measures. It's a wonderful thing to have, but we're also now looking very much how we can take into account the external dimension of all this, of the Green Deal. And there, I think we are having exciting weeks ahead of us because the European Commission is coming up with a well-known proposal on sustainable corporate governance, which is linked to the sustainable finance. And the first emanation of this package was presented by the Commission on Wednesday. It's what the European Union can do to eradicate deforestation from supply chains. And I would like to conclude by saying that COVID-19 has made us all very aware of the deficiencies in supply chains, semiconductors, raw materials, car parts. But it's not only that, it's also that we are aware that when we most needed the personal protection equipment produced by Malaysian factories, the rubber gloves, etc., now we realize that there's a problem in the supply chain. There's forced labor, there is heavy exploitation of migrant labor at the very source of this value chain. And we have to look at that, and I think as the EU we are in a good position to take global leadership in sustainable consumption and production, which has to be, to me, as SDG 12, it has to be a key part of our recovery after the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you already addressed the global dimension of the fairness challenge. And with that in mind, I would now like to turn to Madam Vera Songwe. And I saw that earlier in the year, in the spring, you already warned that the economic buffers of Africa were wearing thin in the post-pandemic context. You appealed for the G20 debt suspension mechanism to be extended and for the IMF to create a new liquidity mechanism for the global economy. But you also said importantly that this, in your view, would have an impact on the low carbon transition of Africa. Now, are your concerns from earlier this year being addressed? And in particular, do you see them indeed impacting on the low carbon transition of African countries? I think you have to unmute.
We don't get used to it yet. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me here, Paweł, and sharing Europe's future conversation. I think in some sense, sharing Europe's future is also part of sharing Africa's future. And clearly COVID-19 has shown us that it is part of sharing the world's future. To answer your question, yes, three things. I think when the crisis hit, we started at the Economic Commission for Africa talking about the need for an immediate and rapid response to this crisis. Unfortunately, I don't think we got that. we did get the debt service suspension initiative. And the debt service suspension initiative was an initiative that was actually born from a conversation hosted by the Economic Commission for Africa with African finance ministers, where African finance ministers agreed that their problem was not bad macroeconomic management. They had just been hit by the biggest shock in 50 years, and which is an external shock. It was an external health shock. And we all thought what we will feel was a health impact. We didn't get that. We got an economic impact. And I think, Heidi spoke about, disruptions in supply chains. We immediately began to see that closures in European economies meant closures in African economies, particularly those that are tourist-related economies. Now, we're just coming back from COP26, and what do we need to do? How we're all talking about growing forward better. The first way to grow forward better is for all of us to get vaccines, but there's still a huge divergence on sort of the access to vaccines conversation. On the growing green and on the green recovery, I think three things that we have been calling for the Economic Commission for Africa, as you rightly said, it's the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. We believe that putting more liquidity into the hands of African economies will allow them to invest in more green and more sustainable areas of their economies. Africa has the distinct advantage that we don't have a lot of stranded assets, maybe out of South Africa or Mozambique that need to decommission coal. Most of Africa still needs to put more energy on the grid. And so we can leapfrog to green energy immediately. One of the things that we are doing concretely, for example, is next week I will be in DRC, and we are looking at battery production. DRC, as you know, has 70% of the world's cobalt. And so essentially, the demand for cars, for electric cars, in the next 10 years today it's about 7 million. It's going to go up to 55 million. And so most of that is going to come from DRC. DRC will start producing batteries. So there's a net contribution to the sort of climate change argument. But also what we need and what we hoped will come out of Glasgow, which we didn't get fully, was a price on carbon. As you know, we have the peatlands of the Congo Basin again, where we've been able to sequester almost 30 million tons of carbon, and huge amounts. If we were to get even the $50 that we're putting for a ton of carbon, into a sort of green fund for Africa, which is not a sort of begging fund or donor fund. It's just because we are net contributors actually to a clean environment. If today the peatlands of the Congo became the Amazon, burnt down and cut for trees, we will be releasing tons of carbon and we will hit the 1.5 degrees. So in some sense, the imperative for a price on carbon is an imperative that says if we can remunerate Africa for keeping the climate clean, then the chances that we will stay below the 1.5 are higher. And we hope that this is where we talk about liquidity, this is where we talk about how we can make sure that we share this future. Africa has shared the future by keeping the peatlands clean. We're sharing the future now by producing batteries. But I think we need the level playing field where we can have some of these more transparent conversations about who are the emitters, what are they doing to reduce their emission, and for those that are conserving, what is the price that we put on carbon so that we can reward them in a just, transparent, and fair manner.
Vera, thank you very much for making that point loud and clear. Now we'll want to come back to you after the introductory session with some more specific questions about the African context and what also Europe and Africa can do together. But since you mentioned the carbon price, I would like to turn to Maria with a question concerning how we can, in an impactful way, change the global coordination on this issue, because as I mentioned in the introduction, 3/4 of emissions are not priced at all. So the carbon price markets are very disjointed. They are regional, and we are clearly lacking a global coordination mechanism. So will the border adjustment tool that Europe is contemplating, will it be the element that will substantially change the logic of that discussion, or are there actions needed in order for us to have a meaningful price of carbon that is globally applied? Maria.
Thank you very much, Paweł, and a very good afternoon to all of you. It's been fascinating listening both to the previous speakers, but also to the previous session that I think links very nicely, certainly to the question that you're posing to me, Paweł. I wanted to make three main points, but specifically on your question on the carbon pricing, I think it is imperative for us to work towards achieving something of that sort, but I think we're very far away from getting there. And I will just note that we don't agree even with the US when it comes down to this. We have agreed and I mean on the price, on developing a price. I think the US administration has other views about this, but of course the US administration is very keen to develop a joint methodology on how to progress on this issue, even if we go down a different way. I think that's very good news, but whether it's going to lead into a world market price, I think that's perhaps very difficult to assess right now. I think we're making small steps in a very big issue, and they are the right steps. Europe is going down one way. What the biggest issue, and I'll come to my main points, is the global coordination, and how can we achieve global coordination to solve some of the common problems. In the United Nations address that President Biden gave last September, he made a very important point that he actually said, without me having to quote him, that our futures are intertwined. And I think that's such an important point to start with. And he's talking about global communities, not just about the countries. Nobody wins unless we all win. Nobody is safe unless we are all safe. And that pertains, of course, to the global public good issues, which for the moment are really the pandemic to begin with, that Vera started with, but of course, climate being the intergenerational public good that we need to start solving decisively today. I find there are a number of issues here. We have instruments to deal with global cooperation, but we don't always have the political willingness to do that because we are always looking inwards rather than looking outwards. And that's true globally, I think. But that is the mindset that the previous session has advocated for. A change in mindset when we're talking about the global public goods is absolutely essential. We are not going to make progress otherwise when it comes to this. And, I worry about, and again, this previous session talked about this, and I'm hoping we can discuss this a little bit more. I worry about the fact that we are forming what we call strategic alliances, when actually we need global alliances. We cannot solve the public good problem if we're only talking to like-minded partners. This is just not the way to address these issues. We need to talk to everybody, and we need to demand that everybody does their bit. And that brings me to my second point, which is the issue of fairness. I would argue that not only is absolutely imperative, but unless solutions are fair, they will not be sustainable. And that is such an important thing. We should start with the fairness component. And, I now link to Glasgow and to COP26. It was really quite disappointing that even the climate finance thing, the 20 billion that we need to find for the next immediate years, they were not there. Leaders committed to come back next year and talk about this thing, but actually in the scope of things, the funds ought to have been found a long time ago. So I can't help but be disappointed about this issue, also because the pathway that Glasgow has given us in terms of coming down to 1.5 does not close the credibility gap. And we just demand more, we need more, and it needs to be fair. And one last thing I wanted to say, seeing this is the European Parliament, we are talking from Europe, for Europe to be able to exert the soft power that Heidi talked about in her introductory remarks, which I certainly agree with, we need to have credible solutions within. If the organization of our own strategies and no solutions are not credible, and here we can talk about from the fiscal framework to monetary policy, the subjects that I happen to know the best, it would be very little chance for Europe to exert the soft power that we undoubtedly have. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. Now, speaking of funding, the one good news that we see happening is that the capital markets are definitely doing their job, meaning there has been a significant resource allocation, and the cost of capital has changed dramatically in the past decade. It is now much more expensive to realize carbon-intensive projects than renewable power. What is more, in 2021, we will have record investments in renewable power, and renewable power will be the largest area in the energy spending. So capital markets are doing their job. And with that, I would like to turn to Mikołaj with a question on how he sees the balance between public and private investment for our transition towards carbon neutrality. Mikołaj.
Thank you, Paweł. I will try to be a bit speculative today, but also whatever I say works for the EU and Europe, but it will also work for the global arena on most of the points. I think, first of all, it is absolutely clear that the public sector cannot deliver alone. And if we look at Europe, we need an extra 350 billion more euro per year to invest more to meet the 2030 targets than if you compare with the amounts invested in the last decade. So the task is enormous, obviously, here, and the pandemic has not made it easier. It has given us all more fragmentation, more complexity, and surely I think the point made by Vice President Hautala was important, that we also have to look at stronger redistribution than in the past. I think this is also key to remember. What I think is also important to remember is we don't really know everything. I mean, we know about the existing investment gaps, what have been the trends in the last decades, but we don't really know how the pandemic will evolve still, and how those investment gaps will actually look like if we project this type of scenarios in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. I think it's also important to remember that the European Union has been going through a number of crises in the last 15 years or so, and I think we should also be creative in thinking how we are able to prevent against future crises, and what kind of buffers we can create here. And I think this reflection is very necessary, and hopefully will be absolutely a key topic in 2022, notably during the French presidency. So if the public sector is not alone, obviously what we need is to mobilize the private sector. And here I think that it's absolutely fantastic to see the effect of the taxonomy. You mentioned already the mobilization of the capital markets, but I think that from the point of view of the EU, it is great to see what kind of effect the taxonomy has had, even though it's not really fully operational yet, and some issues are still unresolved, as we all know. I think that so the signaling effect is vital, but also something which I would like to mention, which is a kind of credibility transfer. First of all, it is credibility transfer within the European Union to some regions and countries, so that we all get more favorable conditions because we are part of this advanced avant-garde of action on climate action. But also it applies globally. I mean, countries that are in the avant-garde should be treated so, and should be getting a better treatment from the financial market. It should be recognized. Of course, this is why in the formats like G7 or G20, and specifically for the EIB in our cooperation with other multilateral development banks, we try to team up with them to foster this type of developments, to try to create enhancements for mobilizing private capital, and therefore to become more effective. I think in general, risk sharing and financial instruments are a very effective way to exploit creativity of the private sector, to exploit possibility to mobilize new resources. We certainly have not enough capital in the public purse to pursue big global objectives with public money alone. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Mikołaj. You already referred to the need to cushion the impact of the transition, and with that question that I would like to now turn to Jakob. We can safely assume that in the longer term, the consumer will be better off if this effort succeeds, and it has to succeed through better climates. But in the short to medium term, there will be an impact on welfare. Now, how to address that, especially across borders, remains a big challenge. For example, the US low-income consumer tends to be very carbon intensive. So in the discussion on border adjustment and on carbon pricing, the regressive nature of carbon taxation will also, of course, play a big role. So how should we go about it? Are the carbon tax and dividend schemes that some countries are experimenting with the right path to follow? And can there be any international orchestration of this effort? Jakob.
Well, thank you very much, Paweł. Well, I mean, on the international side, it's very clear that the Green Transition Fund, the, I guess, increasingly infamous 100 billion a year pledge that was, I guess, kind of sort of finessed at Glasgow as well, is going to be key. It's certainly not going to be enough. And I would say that also there, I would say that international capital, cross-border capital flows, private sector capital flows into developing countries is obviously also going to play a role. I think on what we need to do on cushioning the blow, if you like, because it is to some extent also about that. We have an interesting situation across many of the advanced economies right now, because as an outcome of the pandemic, we are facing with what is, in my opinion, a relatively short-lived burst of inflation. In Europe, it is focused on gas prices, which for a combination of factors have spiked this fall. We've obviously also seen rapid growth also of the global oil price, which is partly unrelated to that. It has more to do with the global reopening. But what's interesting is actually, in my opinion, the reaction to this short-term spike in Europe, but also to some extent, if you're looking at the new measures that President Biden has taken, and actually as of today, also the government of Japan, namely that we're seeing it addressed very directly with fiscal transfers. And I think that's a very important point to make, because yes, this is regressive. It will invariably be regressive. There's nothing we can do about that, in my opinion, for the reasons that you mentioned, namely that, for instance, low-income groups consume relatively, or at least in the advanced countries, consume relatively high number levels of carbon. So we need transfers, and at the same time, I think we should also recognize that the situation we're in Europe right now, with a spike in fossil fuel prices, is actually really good news. It is exactly what we need to accelerate decarbonization. It does require protection of consumer purchasing power, et cetera, and a degree of supply security that ensures that we won't have industrial shutdowns, et cetera. But other than that, and I think it's good to see that most governments in Europe are going down that route, which, by the way, is also the gist of what we're seeing with social spending by the Biden administration in the United States, is really good news. It will be, therefore, the answer to your question, how do we deal with the social regressiveness of this, which is another way of saying, how do we politically insulate the decarbonization drive from political opposition, the yellow vest issue that we saw in France a couple of years ago? The answer is fiscal transfers. And certainly in Europe, the question will be, is the need for what I would consider green transfers, basically buying off those who are adversely affected from this, is that going to, and this is, by the way, what we're seeing now is only going to be the first of those instances over the next many decades. When we in Europe decide how we're going to reform fiscal spending rules, what we're going to do with next generation EU funds, will the need for those kinds of typically at member state level fiscal transfers be fully included in these reforms? I think that that is an open question. But again, I don't think we really have much of a choice. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Jakob. I will want to come back to the international level momentarily, knowing in particular that Vera will need to leave at 3 o'clock. But before we do that, since you said, Jakob, that the spike in energy prices is good news for the low carbon transition, I would want to come back to Maria with a question about how to design that transition, because surely the high energy prices at the moment also reflect a certain degree of tightness and mismatch between demand and supply. And in a recent piece about the European Central Bank and its green transition commitments, you said something very interesting, which I want to quote, namely, while the science of climate change leaves little room for doubt, our understanding of the economic impact is, by contrast, minimal. So can you briefly unpack that for us? If our understanding of the economic impact is minimal, how do we plan the transition strategies?
Thank you, Paweł. Very important question, and a question that that is in our minds, actually, on the economist's mind, I think, very strongly. The knowledge that we have in terms of the impact of the green transition on the macroeconomy is very limited. I'll give you one example, and I think Jakob will relate to this. At the moment, we are observing interest rates that are record minimum level, and it's actually an indication that equilibrium interest rates, so interest rates that actually sort out the economy, are very low, even negative, actually. That is very puzzling if you think about equilibrium having almost very small prices or even negative interest rates. How can your price be negative in equilibrium? These types of things imply that we lack knowledge about some transitions that are happening in the economy, one of them being the green transition. There is other things that are happening, if you take a sort of a broader view, that have changed the equilibrium positions for the economy. They are things like the digital transformation, and we can talk about that if you like, but there's also the entrance into the global economic system of China, which is of course a huge player that operates in what I would like to call a different business model than the Western model, as well as a societal model. But for the moment, the business model of China is slightly different, if not a lot different, to the way that the Western world operates. This has implied that our understanding of our global economic interdependencies is less than full, it's less than perfect. So this is the uncertainty that I point out in this piece. And of course, central bankers and global economic players need to sort of advance their knowledge before they can make credible policy solutions. So when it comes to the green transition, I ask the following question just to indicate the level of uncertainty, the lack of knowledge that we have. Will the demand for green capital in the future increase or decrease the price of capital? And the answer to that is not clear. We all have views and they can go in either direction. But if you're thinking about the steady state, namely what will happen in 20, 30 years from now, do we know what the impact of the green transition is going to be on the price of capital? And the answer is no. The answer is we need to do all the research to get there. And I'm actually delighted, and this is the piece, the message I was trying to drive in this piece is that I am delighted that such an important financial player, namely the central bank, is acknowledging the fact that they have a role to play in there, even if we're operating in a system in which the knowledge of the operations of the system is less than perfect.
Great, thank you so much, Maria. I believe we can safely come back to this question in the second part of the discussion. By the way, I would welcome any reactions from the other speakers. But before Vera has to leave, I would like to zoom in on Africa, because what is happening there is extremely interesting, with a lot of activity now moving to ICT platforms, be it in the area of education, being in the area of health. We can see a substantial rise of energy consumption by these platforms, ICT platforms. And you yourself have spoken about the need for energy substitution rather than energy transition, which seems to imply that Africa could well leapfrog in this process towards the renewables without the more tortuous process of transitioning like Europe is undergoing right now. So can you tell us a little bit more about the situation right now?
No, thank you. Thank you again, Paweł. I think two things, and I would just like to come back very quickly to this conversation on interest rates, because it's quite interesting. Interest rates, the capital markets, and sort of the trillions of dollars that are available, and the low interest rates in particular. I think we on the continent are not enjoying any of that. On the continent, our access to markets is still very high. You know, the spreads for some of our better performing, if not best performing macroeconomic countries are still 600 basis points higher than, you know, some of the not so well performing European economies. So we are not benefiting from any sort of interest rate compression. Secondly, whether you issue a green bond or you offer a plain vanilla bond on the continent, you fetch the same premium. So we're not getting any kinds of sort of additionality from saying, you know, we're going to issue green bonds. And I think we do need to understand why that is the case and how we could make a differentiation in pricing for those two. And I think that's one of the reasons why at the Economic Commission for Africa, we're working on this facility called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which is essentially to see how we can create repo markets that would allow for more liquidity to get injected into our economies and hopefully reduce the cost of market capital and increase investments in sustainable and green investments. Now, this takes me into the conversation on green transition. What is the transition and how does it look like? So we need base load on the continent. We need a lot of base load to be able to power any kind of renewables that we put on our grid. And so, yes, we could leapfrog in some areas, but I must say that, you know, hydrogen is still very expensive. It's still even more expensive for Europe. Yes, we're doing a lot of wind, we're doing a lot of solar, but the wind and the solar need base load. We have three options for base load. We have hydro, which we are using quite substantially. A lot of the economies are now on hydro. We have, of course, fossil fuels, which we are looking to retire, but we also have gas. And I believe that gas must remain as part of Africa's energy mix, at least for the next 20, 25 years, because if we do not have gas, then the conversation around climate, for us, climate change is a conversation also about prosperity. It's a conversation about jobs. It's a conversation about how we get to better outcomes and better obtaining the SDGs. If we take away the possibility of using an energy such as gas to power our development, what ends up happening is that everything else becomes inaccessible. And so essentially we will actually restrain and reduce the size of the people who have access to energy. We will make it more expensive because at the end of the day, it is still expensive if you're only using solar, and it cannot power a lot of our industry. So I think these are some of the things we must think about and we must look at, is to say, yes, there's a lot of still greenfield investment. What do we do with that greenfield investment? Can we afford all of the greenfield investment that is coming in? Or should we, like everybody else, use, you know, a just transition that is balanced and equitable to get us to where we are? And I think this is not just a market imperative, but it's also a just imperative, because if you look at California, yes, uses a lot of green energy, but it is powered by gas. We have just seen, and we talked a lot about the markets and negative interest rates, but we saw for a while there 2 or 3 weeks ago that, you know, all of us who were betting on European growth started not betting on European growth when there was not enough energy, right? Because OPEC had increased the prices. And what happened? Russia gave us gas. And so energy, gas from Russia essentially revived the European economy. I think that the same has to be true for Africa, where we have the gas on our continent, where we can use it while we ensure that we do that transition. And so for us on the continent, we believe that gas must be in our mix. It is a just part of that conversation. And we believe that a lot of the countries that are already transitioning are going to use this for a while and then move over to probably in DRC, like I said, we're doing the whole battery investments, and hopefully we will see and realize material gains much sooner than we expect.
Right. Thank you very much, Vera. Now, before you go, I want to touch upon the EU-African context a little bit, especially given that Werner Hoyer, if I'm not mistaken, is the president of the European Investment Bank, is due to visit Nairobi next week. And he wants to inaugurate their EIB's regional hub in Africa. So if Mikołaj could tell us briefly what the concept behind this is, and Vera, if you could respond by saying what role you see European engagement playing. Mikołaj.
Well, thank you, Paweł. Indeed, I mean, this is linked to the fact that the EIB is launching its development branch on the 1st of January. This is the idea is to go local or go regional, to create closer to where the projects can be, a center of knowledge, expertise, advice, so we can help project promoters to prepare sustainable projects in a more efficient way. And of course, the concept of just transition is a very, very big part of our global efforts, and in Africa notably. So we will be talking a lot about that. I would argue a bit about the role of gas in Europe and beyond, but let's leave it for another conversation. Thank you.
So, Vera, perhaps before you have to go, if you could tell us how you would expect the EU-African relationship to shape up in the area of climate transition.
Yes, no, I'll pick up again from that conversation. Please don't argue, fund gas. Because I think that if we do not fund gas, then we are going to be in a very difficult growth scenario. And so my sense is what we need is a tiering process, right? Maybe we say we fund, because again, there is a little bit of a contradiction, and that's where this crisis has, I think, unearthed some of these conversations around trust, right? You know, the French are putting $6 billion to take gas from Mozambique into Europe. But then we say we're not going to fund gas development in Africa. I think it just leaves us a little bit, confused about what is it that we're really looking for. And so either we say that, we're going to do it and do it for all, level the playing field, or we can then tier it. But my sense is that this conversation that says all the DFIs will not fund gas is probably not the best way to do development for Africa. EIB has been a fantastic partner. I used to work at the IFC. I'm here now, and even here, we're working on, one of the things that we don't talk enough about is that this crisis has hit women the most. It has hit them harder and hardest in many areas. And I think that you've done a fantastic job of putting more resources behind sort of growth for gender and women businesses. I think there's still a lot that we need to do on the agriculture space. And yes, we're talking a lot about climate, but a lot of sort of emissions come from agriculture. So, seeing how we make, the sort of the agriculture more efficient, fertilizer use more efficient, I think is an important part of that conversation. When the crisis hit, you funded a lot of businesses that were getting into the healthcare and the pharmaceutical sector on the continent and have done an amazing job of doing that. So we hope that you continue to do some of that work. We at the Economic Commission for Africa and Afri-Exim Bank have a monthly conversation with all the DFIs that you're part of it. And I think we've been great partners. Having you on the continent is a fantastic idea. As you say, it's always better to be closer to the action because you see it first. So welcome to the continent, and hopefully that we can do good business together. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Vera, for being with us, and thanks for being open and honest also about the transition scenario just now. Thanks so much for joining. I know we have to leave, but we really appreciate you being in the panel.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you so much. So before I take some questions from our viewers and listeners, I would like to go back to Jakob, who wanted to comment on the interest rate question that was touched upon before.
No, I mean, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Maria that we actually know very little about, why is the equilibrium in, the real safe interest rate in most advanced economies, because I also think it's very important what Vera said, namely that, interest rates in many emerging markets is still very high, but we actually don't know very much about why it has come down. However, what we do know is that it has been coming down steadily over the last 30 to 40 years. So in many ways, we can safely say that it actually probably does not have very much to do with the global financial crisis. It certainly doesn't have anything to do with, the low interest rate policies that central banks have had over the last number of years. And therefore, I think it's quite likely, actually, that we will find that funding the green transition probably won't have that much of an effect either. If anything, that will mean that these very low interest rates are going to be greatly facilitating the green transition. And of course, if we then, on top of that, through taxonomies and various other policy incentives, ensures that private capital is directly incentivized to participate as much as possible, again, I don't think we should say that at least, the access to private capital in advanced economies are going to be a particular issue when it comes to financing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. So maybe one more question before opening the floor to the points raised by our viewers. Namely, the capital markets can have, of course, a powerful impact on the supply side of the equation. But when it comes to the demand side of the equation, it's really governments and consumer behavior where we need to look at. And the consumer has arguably not done a great deal towards the low carbon transition, partly because of lack of transparency. Do you think governments will be willing to take steps towards ensuring that greater transparency, so as the consumer begins to change the behavior? Heidi, I think I saw your hands going up.
Yeah, thanks. For my part, I'd like to say that this is exactly what is now happening, because we've had this surge of consumer demand for cleaner, more responsible, more ethical products and services. And now the policymakers are responding to this by putting in place a mechanism which gives the consumer the right to know what is hidden in the value chain, in the supply chain. And I'd like to say that we should look at how we could sort of mobilize the private sector in being more accountable, more green, more carbon, low carbon, etc., respecting more human rights, labor rights, with this mechanism which is now being put in place by the European Union. And it's nothing that arises from out of the blue, because it's based on a unanimous decision by the United Nations 10 years ago, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And now we understand that human rights also encompasses climate, environment. So it's a very comprehensive, integrated approach. And I think this is a great possibility to leverage private sector, capital, but also it's, of course, it's all about money, but it's still not all about money. There can be behavior, corporate behavior can change, and consumers can respond. And there's an interesting interaction these days. So I think this is a force that we haven't really sort of mobilized yet, but it's up and coming.
All right, very good. Thank you, Heidi. So we will know soon that eating a beefsteak is 30 times more carbon intensive per calorie.
Come on, you know
tofu, right? Anyway, so let's go now to the questions which we are receiving, and they are visible on the screen. And let me read out the first one. Has the outcome of COP26 offered some hope for a sustainable green transition? Would anyone like to comment on this question? Jakob, please.
I mean, I actually think in some ways that it was more positive than I had feared. I would point to, for instance, the fact that on the first trading day after COP26, we saw the highest carbon price in Europe ever. I think that's clearly a market signal that that this was a strong push in the right direction. But I would also say that I do think that probably the biggest factor was that we got near universal commitment to zero carbon by mid-century. Then we can say whether it's 2050 or 60 or 70. I wouldn't go as far as to say I don't care, but I think the key issue is that businesses, because it is businesses that must now know that in the long run they're going to have to operate in a decarbonized global economy by 2050 or slightly thereafter. They're going to have to change now their business model going forward, and I have no doubt that they will do so. So I think that was that, as well as the methane beginning of methane reductions that you mentioned, I think was very positive. There was a setback on coal, but nonetheless, I think things like CBAM, et cetera, will address a lot of that. What we probably missed was some of the government commitments to have the level of ambition on the the 2030 commitments. They were lacking, in my opinion. But so it's a mixed bag. But overall, I would say that there was a lot in the long run to be happy about. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Any other comments to this question?
May I add something?
Please.
Yes, of course, you can discuss for hours the result of COP26. I think it was, however, a very big awareness-raising moment. But I would like to mention something which is perhaps not on the front pages of the newspapers, but a lot of agreements and new pledges have been made on behalf of the global financial community by the multilateral development banks. I mean, but also the things that happened for the first time, a global pledge for South Africa, a global methane pledge, but also the recognition of the effect of climate emergency on women and their global situation. And here also a committed action by the multilateral development banks to work on that topic. I think these are new elements. Maybe they are not groundbreaking, but they certainly, I would say, balance a bit the perception about this particular meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikołaj. I also saw Maria and Heidi wanting to comment. So Maria, maybe first and then Heidi.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to perhaps say that we cannot afford not to acknowledge what has happened, even if we have wanted more. I think small steps are better than no steps, and just the eye on the ball here. 2022 is a year where we come back, hopefully with additional small steps, steps in the right direction. Nevertheless, I think I would like to reiterate the point that I made earlier on, and I think in all her comments, Vera actually said the same thing. Everybody has to do their own share, and it has to be fair. Poorer countries have got the right to grow, so it really is. It is really the richer part of the world that need to step up here, as also the biggest polluters on the stock of the pollution that we have to resolve now, and also an intergenerational transfer. We're doing it also across generations. So I think it's crucial that we pay emphasis to the fair transition. Otherwise, we just won't make as much progress as we need to.
Thank you so much, Maria and Heidi.
Yeah, I think this change of the rhythm of the negotiations and process is very important, because that we are going back to the negotiations and we have a kind of a checkpoint already next year, like Maria says. I think this is really important, because if I remember well, I think maybe 35 years ago, I remember I had a Greenpeace T-shirt who said, "We have no time to waste." And now I think we all know that we have no time to waste, 35 years after some started. So indeed, and I also have a little bit the feeling what Jakob hinted at, that at the moment I see businesses being more on the forefront than policymakers. We policymakers, we are still struggling with different interests. We have our conflicts of interests. We are serving different communities. It's very hard to change, for instance, the common agriculture policy in the EU, even if we very well know that this would be a primary field to bring some change. So, but the EU is nevertheless, I think, is in a again, I would say, in a favorable position, because we don't just have pledges, we also have a Fit for 55. Today I heard that in French they call it le fit. We have le fit. So it's a good point to become even more proactive. And the coal stuff, I think, is something that we as the EU have to take very seriously, the subsidies of coal. And by the way, also oil and gas. I'm sure that the Mozambican gas should be used in Africa and not in Europe. So I hope gas doesn't get too much subsidies in the future. And that's something also for the EIB to think about, I guess.
Well, if I may, the EIB is not financing any more gas, unabated fuel, the fossil fuels, as you probably know. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mikołaj, for that clarification. I was going to ask you also about EIB becoming the EU's green bank, how advanced you think you are with, I think, 40% of investments in 2020 going to environmental and green projects. Some environmental NGOs have written to you drawing attention to the remaining part of your investments, which often go to finance airports, roads, etc. So maybe you could comment briefly on how you see the EIB's own transition into Europe's Green Bank.
Well, thank you, Paweł. The transition is going very well if you look at the numbers. Of course, the pandemic has changed a lot in the European economy. Also, the type of projects that we can be doing, we had to shift a lot of focus on providing liquidity also to companies, the private sector in Europe. But the rollout of the climate roadmap, also our work outside the EU, notably in this domain, it's going extremely well. And the partnerships we are building with other multilateral development banks, but also with private foundations and companies are really exciting. I think there's a lot in the green innovation where Europe can lead, and this is what European entrepreneurs are telling us in our investment survey, that this is Europe is in the lead when it comes to green investment, and we certainly want to support that. And we are obviously very committed to that. And as I said, on energy lending, we have basically finished the transition period, phasing out our support for the projects with fossil fuel components, and this is basically decided and done. So there's no question about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mikołaj. I can see that Maria would like to react.
I just wanted to say that I feel that the EIB, but also the other development banks, national development banks in Europe and beyond, have got a pivotal role to play in this, simply because they have got the right structure to address some of the risks. We said earlier on about the uncertainties that we have. Multinational banks have got, development banks have got the capacity to absorb the unknown, as it were, because they take the long term, in combination with good taxonomy criteria, which I definitely would like to push for. Then I think the multilateral banks have got a very important role to play in this respect.
Very good. Thank you, Heidi.
Paweł, just half a second. Yes, I think EIB is doing wonderfully in this green transition, but I'm afraid that the politicians are sort of watering down a little bit your ambitions by this struggle about taxonomy. And I'm sort of that's my reason for saying that. I think that the businesses perhaps would be a little more green than politicians. Now we will have to see in the coming weeks and months what comes out of these taxonomy decisions, but it's a real political battlefield.
Right, so we have 9 minutes left, and I would like to give you each some time at the end for concluding remarks, but let's tackle one more question which has arrived from our viewers, and it has to do with the social dimension. So we have a question: are social inequalities growing within societies more than between societies? And maybe we could link that with another question: could green become the new social? So our participant says that green fiscal transfers might be easier to justify, since public intervention in energy markets is less controversial than standard welfare redistribution. At the same time, the transition may add another layer of life risks, energy poverty. So who would like to answer that? Jakob, please.
Well, I mean, I think the answer to the first question is, or part of the first question, namely, is there more inequality within countries than between countries, is unambiguously yes, because I mean, we know that over the last number of decades, inequality among countries has generally declined quite dramatically. Inequality within countries, of course, in many places have gone the opposite way. But as I said earlier, I'm a very strong supporter of, the need for green transfers, because I think, if anything, the lesson from the yellow vest movement a couple of years ago, but also the speed at which governments have been, and I would commend them for doing so, reacted to the spike in energy prices in the last couple of months, shows us that yes, the public support is generally behind the noble goal of decarbonization. But when and I think you alluded to it yourself, Paweł, so far, how many consumers are actually dramatically changing their lifestyles as a result of this? And we haven't even begun to see the full effect of the relative price changes that we need to see. That will only happen when, carbon pricing is, if you like, 100% of all emissions. Now, that will never happen. But I mean, you mentioned, red stakes. Well, that is going to be the new champagne. If it was fully priced based on, the emissions associated with the production of red meat, it would be the equivalent of having a glass of champagne once a month, or that kind of thing. So in that light, yes, absolutely, we need green transfers, and green in that sense is the new social, because with the goals, the very ambitious goals that we've set ourselves just for the next not even a decade, there's going to be massive upheaval. The immaculate decarbonization isn't going to happen because, not only don't we have any time to spare, but we have a lot of time to catch up with. And the full effect of the relative price effect of that is going to have significant political consequences. And as I see it, green transfers is the only response to it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Jakob. So in now the round of concluding remarks, what I would really invite you to focus upon is how do we plan and strategize the transition? Because we mentioned several elements, and the green transfers were just the last ones. There is a lot that can be said about the endowment part of the equation and the job creation in the green economy, but at the end, it all comes down to the question how to plan the 30-year period that is ahead of us towards net neutrality. So I would welcome some concluding remarks with that angle, maybe starting with Maria.
Thank you very much, Paweł. So I would, we raised in all conversations the fact that everybody has a role to play, and I think I'd like to emphasize that it just isn't somebody else's problem. It really is every single person's problem, every single institution's problem. We talked about the central banks, we talked about consumers having to eat less steaks. Everybody has got a role, has got something to do, and we all need to step up. I would like to pick on one thing, simply because Jakob actually raised it at the beginning, and because it's going to be the subject of conversation in the next year here in Europe, and that is the fiscal framework, the revision of the fiscal framework. It is a unique opportunity to try and make a change in the direction that is going to help us plan the next 30 years. And there's many opportunities to do good here, and many discussions, many suggestions that are already out there. So it's not very difficult to think about that. I would urge the politicians not to fight old battles, but to look forward and use the instruments that we have in our hands to try and make good changes in this respect. And with that, I would also like to point out that the New Generation EU Fund, which is an amazing template for working on issues like the green and other transformations that we have. It's already operational. It needs to be still proven in action, but it's operational and it's fulfilling its mandate, at least where we are right now. I'd like us to think about using that as we move beyond the 7-year horizon for which it is operational and put it into good use also for the green transition.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. Now, Mikołaj, European Parliament had a resolution over the summer calling on the EIB to be more concretely involved in the just transition as well. So how do you see yourself from the perspective of the bank squaring the circle when it comes to objectives of green transition and fairness?
Well, I could talk for hours about just transition because despite inexistent EU framework for global just transition, we try to figure out what role we could have actually. So this is a very interesting conversation. But just to cut this to a short comment, I would say I think that the pandemic has also exacerbated global inequality, and we don't exactly know yet how much and in what way, but we know it is happening. And I think that the just transition is the only way to go. We have to provide a solution for everyone in the global community to be able to take part in this in the climate action if we want to succeed. So we have to find ways. And on just transition, I think we will need diversified tools. But one thing remains global, and it's a certain thing we can assume is 100% sure, which is we need financial intermediaries. We need intermediaries to be able to borrow on the markets and transform it into long-term sustainable financing. And so you need both public and private financial actors here. And of course, my last point here, just to change the focus a bit to geopolitical one, I think that it's clear that Asia, notably South Korea and Japan, are rebounding quicker than the EU. We also have to see exactly how China is changing. And I think this is also very important for us to see how we can maintain our lead in innovation, in climate action, and what opportunities we can see in those developments. But I also agree with Maria that for Europe, the discussion on the fiscal framework, as I already said in the beginning, that's an absolutely key, vital element for the 2022 agenda. And I hope we can find solutions which will last decades and which will put us on a new path. We have to think out of the box and not necessarily always also use the same institutions and the same methods as before. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Mikołaj. And now, Jakob, you spoke about the cushioning effect of social transfers. But how do we make sure that they are not a defensive action, but rather a proactive one that builds a societal consensus for the green transition?
No, I mean, I think that'll be very difficult to avoid. But I mean, I think, anybody who's been working on, say, trade policy for many decades will know that there is an inherent aspect here of defensive policies. I mean, ultimately, that is, what social transfers is at least partly about. It's about social justice. It's about many things, but it's also about political stability. And that's what we're talking about here. So you cannot avoid that these are reactive, but we can certainly, as Maria also mentioned, put in place a fiscal framework that allows, in the case of the EU, member state governments to deploy these types of green transfers, which will invariably differ from member state to member state. And I would certainly also say that when we're talking about the package that needs to be negotiated, which of course includes both the fiscal rules and the Stability and Growth Pact and what to do in the long run with the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, I think these issues should be at the forefront. On top of that, I would just say that I think we also, because you asked for the sort of 30-year time horizon, we need to recognize that we're not taxing or like we're used to sin tax cigarettes or gasoline. carbon taxation is a different animal. We're taxing to eliminate the use of carbon in the economy. Now, that also has the effect of that carbon-based revenues are by definition temporary revenues. So in the long run, governments in Europe and elsewhere are going to have to find other ways of taxing or deriving revenues because carbon-based revenues aren't going to be there in any magnitude in the long run. And then finally, of course, there is also a geopolitical aspect to this from Europe, because, what does Europe's neighborhood look like when Europe decarbonizes? I think it's well known that Russia will probably have a problem with finding gas customers for, much of it gas. But on top of that, I give you Algeria. What are we going to do if Algeria is suddenly a country without fossil fuel revenue? So there is also, a regional political challenge that flows from the decarbonization that we hopefully can succeed with here in Europe that needs to be, brought forward and basically considered today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob. And Heidi, the last word goes to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's again been a fascinating opportunity to learn. And I think what I would take away from this discussion above all is that indeed it would be very important to do research and understand the macroeconomic impact of the green transition, also the geopolitical impact, which also Jakob has now mentioned. But I do think that the policymakers in Europe could do much more to set the prices right. We're not really addressing those harmful subsidies. I believe that if we had more transparency and accountability in decision making, it would be easier to tackle those wrongly set subsidies. Lastly, I'd like to say that, and I'll go back to the last question to us, which was about if the green will be the new social. Then I often feel that we need to understand that indeed everyone has a role to play, and I'm particularly thinking of people who do very basic jobs in our societies. They take care of our health, they repair our houses, they maintain our streets, all that. That can also be a mission with some purpose and importance for people. So we should be much more inclusive in how we sort of understand this whole mission that we are on. And if we do that, then maybe we would have a more like Paweł, you shaped it by saying that we need to build consensus. I believe we need to build consensus and acceptance to what we're doing, but it has to be a project for everyone, not just for high-flying academics and whatever. I even think that the young people should be addressed in this way, because not everybody has to be a master of economics. You can be a builder, and you can do wonderful jobs for carbon-free future. So I finish with this, and I thank you all very much.
Good. Thank you so much, Heidi. You ended our discussion on a high note. I think there was a lot of underlying optimism and passion from our speakers, even though I think it's also abundantly clear that the nature of the transition is such that many questions remain unanswered, including about the macroeconomic consequences and implications. And this will have, of course, a huge impact on how the transition is planned and engineered. I would like to thank very warmly our speakers, so Heidi, Maria, Vera, who is no longer with us, but who was here for most of the discussion, Mikołaj and Jakob. This was extremely enjoyable and useful, and we're now turning and passing the baton to the next session, which will start momentarily. Thank you very much.